Hello there, my name's Brandon and I make pictures out of tiny squares, and today we're going to be making this animated bouncing slime. I feel like it's a good exercise to explore a few principles of animation, and I'll show you how to use the grid style nature pixel art to kind of plan out everything for this animation. You know, we don't have to freehand everything, we can sort of work it out with simple math since we have that grid to work with. So let's get going and make some slime. Alright, before I start building an animation, I usually begin by just figuring out what the final rendered character sprite is going to look like. Of course, this can change once you start making an animation, but it's kind of a logical flow to at least know what your character looks like before going the extra step of creating an animation for them. So when deciding on a style, a few broad considerations that I keep in mind are sprite size, the use of outline or no outlines, and the number of colors that you use. I decided to make a small outline sprite, so I started by just dropping down a perfect circle by using the pencil tool set to a size of 15 pixels. From here I erased the inside pixels to leave just the outline of the circle. I added a few eyes because I like how that looks, then filled in the rest with a shade of green I like, and then finished it off with some singular shading and highlight colors. And keep in mind that there's lots of colors to choose from, and you may want more out of your slime than just the classic green. Maybe it could have a cool elemental effect you want to pair with a certain color. So here's a bunch I've thrown together just if you'd like some suggestions of color pairings with their highlight and shade tones to play around with. Keep in mind that all the colors here weren't really made to work together as a palette for like a full illustration, more just individual character colors for the purposes of this video. For mine, I'm sticking with green because it's hard to beat a classic. So now we've decided on sprite size, style, and overall coloring. Now when we eventually animate it, we'll be aware of the design features that should be maintained and animate along with the movement itself. So at this point, if all we did was animate the position of our slime sprite to make it jump, the result isn't really that thrilling. It's missing the bounciness and exaggeration that we expect to see out of this material. In animation, there's a principle called squash and stretch, which describes this kind of exaggeration and elasticity for dynamic objects. For example, if this slime ball was just dropped onto the ground, the force of that impact causes it to squish, or like squash, I guess, where the height is compressed and the sides move away. Likewise, if it were flying vertically through the air, either from falling or maybe from having rebounded off the ground, that quick action can be conveyed by a stretching motion where the height elongates and the sides move in. Again, this depends on the rigidity or elasticity of the material itself. Like, if we were animating a bowling ball, we wouldn't expect it to behave like this, but something like a slime material definitely needs this treatment. So how do we actually figure out the right squash or stretch for our animation? Well, one of the keys to squash and stretch is that the overall area or volume of the object should be maintained. Remember, we're not creating or destroying matter here, we're only distorting its shape. And since pixel art exists within a grid space, we can use the pixel measurements to plan out these distorted frames in a really simple way. Our circular slime sprite occupies a space of 15 pixels by 15 pixels, which we can approximate as a square. So a 15 by 15 pixel square has an area of 225 pixels. Now, when distorting the length and width of this square, we should verify that the area of any squashed or stretched variations is also maintained at 225 pixels of area, or as close as we can manage within our pixel art resolution. So let's do a few stretches to show you what I'm talking about. I like to implement it symmetrically, so starting from the 15 by 15 pixel object, we can take away a single pixel from both the left and right sides, and then add a single pixel to the top and bottom, making sure to clean up and maintain the same outline look within this new space. This leaves us with a rectangle that is 13 pixels wide by 17 pixels tall, which calculates out to an area of 221 pixels, very close to that of our original area, so this will do just fine. Going a couple steps further, I could also create stretch frames that are 11 by 21 and 9 by 25 pixels, which both approximately maintain the original area and also stick with being odd-numbered lengths that maintain the symmetry. And here's kind of a fun shortcut. We worked out all these stretch sizes, and we can just reverse the width and the heights to use those same dimensions for the squash side of things. You could actually just copy-paste those frames and then rotate them 90 degrees. I mean, in my case, I also needed to reposition the eyes just so they're facing the right way. And then let me just show you, if we were to loop all of these frames back and forth, already we get a really nice bouncy idle type animation. Now you're kind of getting a sense of the material, and the motion that it's making looks correct because each frame is maintaining the overall area of that object. Now, we could move on to placing these boxy frames as a jumping animation, but it's also a good time to just first render them in our chosen style before moving forward. Everyone's workflow is different, of course, but I find that it's good to have all these sprite frames sitting as individual layers in your file, and then go through one by one and add the necessary rounding to the shapes along with whatever shading, highlights, and other decoration was worked out from the earlier planning steps. For mine, a couple things I paid attention to are that the features like the shading and highlights and the eyes also squash and stretch along with the overall shape itself to really sell that distortion. Alright, so with all that in place, now it's time to get them together as an animation. The motion of the jump itself is going to follow a 10 frame loop. You could experiment with more frames or fewer frames, but I find that 10 frames is enough to work with. As for the jump height per frame, I've heard sometimes people say like, just feel it out or whatever, but I'm a numbers guy, so I like to plan it out, like with math, you know? What I find to work, at least as sort of a rough place to start, is to have the sprite jump high off the ground instantly from its resting position, and then every frame after that, the distance it'll continue to move up is cut in half each time. So let's say the first jump of the frame lifts the sprite up by 16 pixels. In the next frame, it'll go up by another 8 pixels, then 4, 2, and 1. It's something I like to call the half-life principle, and maybe there's some terminology that already exists for this kind of thing, but that's just what I'm going to call it for this video. From here, it's just a matter of reassigning each frame a complementary squash or stretch sprite to match that motion. So for the fast 16 pixel jump, I go straight from a squash into one of the bigger stretches just to exaggerate that transition. Then have the stretch become smaller and restore towards the neutral pose towards the apex of the jump. Likewise, on its way back down, it stretches again and then squashes into the ground. I've also thrown in one of the squash frames at the top of the jump because it creates like a nice little bit of jiggle right there. By the way, if anyone's got their own tricks for determining jump height and appearance, particularly like maybe from a game dev point of view or anything like that, feel free to share it in the comments because I'm kind of curious how other people like to plan this sort of thing out. Alright, so that was a bit of a crash course in this kind of animation. I hope that it was clear enough and kind of gives you some direction if you want to attempt this sort of thing. Slime animations are great because they're kind of forgiving since they're sort of amorphous anyway, so they're definitely a lot of fun to play around with for just exploring animated work. So thank you for watching, and take care and keep it square.